Hello everyone, Dr. Yonit Arthur here, audiologist and strength coach, and you are on The Steady Coach. Today we're going to be talking about recurrences of chronic dizziness symptoms after chronic dizziness symptoms have stopped. This is something people will often call relapses or having symptoms recur after a remission. These are all terms I really don't like, but I know that for many of you who've never recovered from your chronic dizziness symptoms, this is a major source of fear and anxiety for you. Not only are you worried about whether you're going to get yourself out of this right now, you're worried if this is just going to happen to you again. If you're in that stage right now, if you're worried you're never going to get better now, and you're worried that it could come back later, stop watching this video right now. It's not going to be helpful to you because anything that I say is just going to feed into the anxiety that you're already feeling. Please take my advice and focus on your recovery right now. And I will include some video links in the video description below that you can click on to watch that I think will be much more helpful for you than this video will be at this stage. But for those of you who are really kind of getting the hang of this idea that your dizziness is something that you can recover from, that's neuroplastic, in other words, comes from a neural circuit in your brain, and that you're going to be able to recover from this, it really is useful to understand why some people have recurrences of these symptoms later on. The reason I don't like words like remission and relapse are because they imply that this is a lifelong chronic condition, and that's just not been my experience and the experience of my colleagues who've been doing this for decades. Much longer than I have, much longer than most of you have had your symptoms. People can make permanent recoveries from chronic symptoms. I've said in previous videos that the words we use really matter. And if we set the expectation from day one that you're stuck with this and you're stuck at the whim of this neural circuit dizziness for the rest of your life, then that's the expectation that you're going to go into your recovery with, and I don't think that that's going to lead you to an optimal outcome, which is why I prefer to use the term recurrence. It happened again. It's not some continuation of some thing that happens and it's always in the background and you're at its mercy. It's something that you got better from and then happened again. So I'm going to be referring to this as a recurrence. And what does a recurrence mean? It means that you recovered from chronic dizziness symptoms, which I generally define as dizziness symptoms that are medically unexplained, that persist for longer than about 3 to 6 months. Depends on what medical condition, if any, may have originally set it off, but dizziness that is lasting longer than a few months and that has no medical explanation. So recurrence would mean that you had an episode of chronic dizziness symptoms, you got out of them, and now you have them again. And before I jump into a little more depth on why I've seen this happen, I want to also be very clear about something. Dizziness sensations are normal, and that might be really hard to hear when you are having trouble functioning because you're having so many of them. So having that level of symptom, that frequency or constant symptoms, that's not normal. That's not okay. That's not something that I want you to have to live with. But I can tell you that people without chronic dizziness have dizziness symptoms, visual vertigo, floatiness, heaviness, feeling like they're walking on a trampoline, rocking, bobbing, swaying. All of those things are actually normal. And there have been studies that actually show this. In fact, a study that was published just a few years ago, and I can link to the abstract in the video description here, found that triple PD, for example, exists in a spectrum across the entire population. So people who don't have triple PD, people who don't report chronic dizziness, have symptoms of triple PD periodically, occasionally, even persisting for a little while. And according to this study, the prevalence, in other words, how many or what percentage of the population had these symptoms at any given time, they estimated between 4 and 10%. So that's a lot of people. And my point here isn't to scare you and say, oh, you're going to be dizzy forever. It's dizziness is normal to an extent. And when you're in the thick of it, just thinking about that can be terrifying because you don't want to be stuck where you are. But it's really important to have a baseline expectation that you're not going to have a sensation-free life. That if you spin quickly or you're feeling off one day, you might not feel 100%, and that goes for 100% of human beings. So I want to start by saying that, and I want you to also, if you have some time, listen to the interview that I did with Christy Weepy, who's an amazing psychotherapist and also had her own dizziness experience. And she talks about this and what it looks like in her life now. So please see the video description for a link to that interview. Now, reasons why I see recurrences happen and people end up with dizziness symptoms again. The first one is that they recovered passively the first time. And that might mean either that they don't know how they recovered. That's the story that I actually hear quite a lot. Oh, yep, I just recovered spontaneously, or yeah, I'm not even really sure what I did, it just went away. Either that, or they were treated passively. They went through the typical regimen of medication plus VRT, and they addressed their fears of the symptoms perhaps a little bit through maybe some CBT methods thrown in there, but they never really did any digging into what the underlying cause of their danger mode was. Why did the symptoms become chronic in the first place? So when someone recovers passively, that person hasn't done any digging into, or more importantly, making changes in the root mechanisms that have led to this chronic dizziness happening in the first place. And in those cases, unfortunately, that person ends up being vulnerable to it happening again. If danger mode is still on, and that person has a random normal dizziness sensation, because as I mentioned, this is very common in the population in general, we can basically expect that that's going to happen at some point. That person hasn't really done anything to prevent that huge danger response to kick in again and cause chronic symptoms again. So to recap, if someone has recovered relatively passively, doesn't really understand how they recovered the first time, or was just given a bunch of treatment and that fixed everything, the underlying root of why the symptoms happened in the first place, why the chronicity happened in the first place, have not necessarily been addressed, and that person is vulnerable to it happening again. The second reason that I see recurrences happen is because someone has never really worked through the fear response and is sitting around terrified that the symptoms are going to happen again. Now, does this mean that that person is paralyzed with fear all the time? No, but the person is generally quite hypervigilant about his or her health, still looking for odd sensations here and there, still terrified by the idea that it could happen again. And again, I'm not saying that this doesn't make sense. We've talked a lot on my channel about just how automatic these fear responses can be to a vestibular issue. So this isn't a blame thing, but the higher someone's anticipation and fear of recurrences are, the more likely that person is to have recurrences. And in contrast, when people recover, and I think they're a lot less likely to have a recurrence, they don't tend to be as afraid of it anymore. Not to say that they anticipate vestibular symptoms with joy or that they like dizziness, but they don't feel this sheer terror and anticipation response to thinking about dizziness. And the way you can gauge this is if you hear a story of someone's dizziness or read a YouTube comment talking about someone else's symptoms. If you can be compassionate and separate you're not terrified of the symptoms anymore. But if you're in a state of mind where as soon as you get better, you're like, I'm never reading anything about dizziness ever again. If anyone mentions that around me again, I'm gonna have it again, and you have kind of this superstitious component to your thinking about it, you're actually more likely to respond with a huge fear response when you have any kind of sensation, dizziness or not, and that also makes recurrence more likely. And the third reason why I see recurrences is that someone recovered previously by focusing only on neuroplasticity around the symptoms. This is a little bit of a tricky one, little different from the first two, because in this category, people did a lot of work to recover from the first round of symptoms. However, the kind of work they did was helping extinguish that fear response to the symptoms themselves and rewire the brain around the symptoms only. So when you hear of people who've done neuroplasticity programs that involved losing their fear response, totally valid method, and visualizing the lives they want, also totally a valid method, but they didn't really look into what was driving this in the first place and resolve those things. Again, the root cause of all of this hasn't been addressed yet. And I've talked about this very extensively on my channel, so I'm not going to go into a long speech about it here. But in general, I view past stressors and internal stressors we put on ourselves as the underlying cause of danger mode in the brain that ends up leading to chronic symptoms. So if someone's gotten better by conquering fears and visualizing a better life, that's fantastic. There's nothing wrong with that. But if that person hasn't addressed past stressors, including past traumatic experiences and more subtle attachment issues that may have happened in childhood that have led to this overactive nervous system, and or some of these internal pressures that we tend to put on ourselves, then again, that person is still more likely than the average person to go into this hypervigilant danger mode situation in response to what could be, again, a totally ordinary symptom. And the fourth reason that people get recurrences, I think this is a lot rarer, but it can happen, that someone goes through extreme trauma or stress and that lights up that danger mode response again. Even if that person has worked through a lot of the other things we just previously talked about, everyone has a threshold of tolerance here. And if something truly extreme happens, that can cause the brain's danger mode to light up and physical symptoms to start happening. And for this one, I think the key is realizing that the dizziness in this case is a sign of post-traumatic stress. It's not even really what I would think of as a general recurrence. And in those cases, addressing the traumatic stress is a must. So taking all four of these together, what are some of the things that you can do to make sure that you are less likely to have a recurrence later on? The first one and most important one is education. You can always come back to a video like this one to hear some reassurance that many people have weird dizziness symptoms sometimes, and that doesn't mean it's becoming chronic again. It's perfectly normal to have a few off days, especially when you're not feeling well or you're under stress. The second thing is, it is really, really, really important to address your fear of symptoms and to find ways of reducing that anticipation of or suspiciousness about whether you're going to have symptoms again. And I talk about this a bit here on my channel, but this actually ties in to my next recommendation as well. My next recommendation, number 3, is to make sure that you're not just addressing your fear of symptoms, but the general patterns that have led you to be hypervigilant in the first place. And in that case, you're going to be addressing 2 problems with the same component. First, you're going to reduce your fear in general when you understand the patterns and start to address those. But also, you are addressing the actual source of your danger mode rather than relying on neuroplasticity and just worrying about the symptoms alone. And that's going to help make sure you're less vulnerable to it later on. And bonus number 4, I think the most important skill that you can develop throughout this recovery process is self-compassion. And when I say self-compassion, I'm not referring to self-care routines like taking a long hot shower or getting a massage, although you're totally welcome to do those things and that's great as well. But noticing our own patterns of applying internal pressure to ourselves and seeing how we can undo some of those automatic patterns. Less internal stress, more self-love means less danger mode in general, and that is how we avoid recurrences. I hope this video was helpful for you, and if you enjoyed it, please like, share, and please subscribe to my channel. It helps me get this message to more people. Have a wonderful day, guys, and thanks for tuning in. I'll talk to you soon.